Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English and Unit 6. Now, if you'll take a look in your hymnal at the page 1027, you'll see that Unit 6 is going to be focused on the theme of heroism. The big question will be, do heroes have responsibilities? And if you'll flip the page really quickly over to 1028, you'll see that question about heroes and responsibility again being asked and the exploration of the big question. What we're going to do now, as we get ready for our guided study of the Odyssey, is to pay particular attention to these opening pages of Unit 6 in the same way that we paid attention to the opening pages of Units 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, as we kind of get ready for a study of the Odyssey, Homer's classic story of Odysseus and his famous journey from the walls of Troy to try and get back home. We're going to do a number of things in our Unit 6 study. We're going to mess around with this thing called the Troy Tale, T-A-L-E. I would definitely write that one down. You're going to hear a whole lot about that story as we go forward. We're going to talk about epic poetry. I would definitely write that one down. A style of poetry that we are going to recognize as the oldest form of poetry on the planet. If you are at all interested in the music form that today is known as rap music, or at times now it's beginning to be even changed from that designator, but that notion that you can use the language in some kind of rhythmic way to express a certain kind of feeling, emotion, or message, all of that traces back to a single name, Homer, H-O-M-E-R. I would definitely write that down. So in Unit 6, we're going to meet this chap named Homer. We're going to talk about the power of the Iliad and the Odyssey as two poems that will set us up in Western tradition for this notion of the great storytelling. I have said before in other moments with you that in some interesting way, we are the stories that we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. And one of the earliest stories in the Western tradition is in fact the Troy Tale, so we'll be messing around with that. As we get ready for this study, though, I just want to remind you on 1029, the vocabulary study, you'll notice there some of the vocabulary words that are provided. Obligation, for example, is an interesting word. Or like a word like wisdom. It may be the case that you've heard the word wisdom before, but maybe you didn't really appreciate its meaning. We will investigate, for example, at the philosophic level, a word like wisdom. In the early instantiations, the Greeks understood that there were two things that made them different from the gods. The gods had immortality. That is to say, they never died, right? Humans, obviously, mortal. And the gods had knowledge that humans don't have, right? God's knowledge is at times remarkable. They often seem to know everything. Humans know very, very little. And so the Greeks invented this idea that the gods will give humans some kind of knowledge or insight, dare we say it, wisdom, through the poet, the artist. In other words, the singer, the one who gives the words to the rest. How does that happen? Through inspiration. Whoa, what an interesting word. I would maybe write that word down. Inspiration. To inspire. That is to say, to put into. Well, how does that work? Simple. The gods give information to a very particular and special person, namely the artist. The artist in Greek culture then serves as the center of that culture. Some argue the glue of that culture. But it's not that the artist makes this stuff up all on his own. And in the early days of Greek culture, it was predominantly a male activity. That's why I said his. However, we know that there were in fact female artists and poets, no question. But in a patriarchal society, usually it's the males who are given this august role of introducing ideas and concepts that are inspired by the muse. Are you familiar with that term, that amuses me? That notion of the muse is the idea that the gods give to a very particular person a set of ideas or concepts, or can we say it this way, words, Those words are then rapped, spoken in a very rhythmic fashion. That rhythmic fashion is huge because this is a culture that will, for a very long time, not write these songs down. They are rather memorized. And you know this if you look, for example, at your playlist. I can play 30 seconds of any song on your playlist, and you can immediately begin to recite or sing all of the words of that song to me. It is a remarkable phenomenon. Students today who tell me I can't memorize stuff, I'll say, that is not true. That is not true. I can play thousands of songs, and you can give me all the words of those songs. If you were to put all the words of those songs on a sheet of paper, you would be stunned at how much you actually have memorized. Why is it so easy to memorize a song? Rhythms have a lot to do with it. So that repetition of certain sounds in the Greek will become then these famous epic poems. Notice on page 1030, we're already beginning with that term oral tradition. Let's get that one in our notes. What do we mean by oral tradition as opposed to what? Written tradition. Okay? In other words, we're talking about stories that are long before they're ever written down, told. And notice I'm reading now with you on 1030. They will teach a cultural's central values and beliefs. That is to say, they are the national song. Now this is huge because by the time you're seniors, and you're studying with me again Homer, and you're studying, for example, the great Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf, we will point out that these epics are fundamentally about the national anthem, the national song. What is it that we most treasure in our society? That's usually explained in the form of some kind of song. That is to say, universal themes. And what is some of the most important universal themes? The hero and the hero's quest or journey. I would write that down. The hero and the hero's journey. To that degree, we could argue that what then we are about to study is in large measure kind of a summation of a whole lot of what we have been looking at. The short stories, the essays, the plays, the poems are all in some ways, their genesis are going to begin with these kinds of epic traditions. Notice the bold letters on page 1030. I'm not going to read all of this with you, but I just kind of want you to at least have a sense of it. Again, oral tradition, storytellers and poets of long ago did not write the tales they told. Instead, as we've said, they learned them and then they memorized them. That is to say, the oral tradition, that handing down from one group to another group. For those of you that know Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, you know that we are living in a culture in that story where books are now banned. They're burned, of course. And at the very end of that novel, you have that really interesting moment when the only way left for books to survive is for an individual to memorize every word of the book. By the way, for those of you that know the Book of Eli film, you are as well already familiar with this idea. You memorize the book, and then you transmit the book to another younger person who is then raised into society as the possessor of that song or the possessor of that book. That's what we mean by the oral tradition. Notice we've got issues of points of view, perspectives on life. Now I'm just reading some of the bold information on 1030. The cultural experiences, the social and cultural context. We've got themes, and especially universal themes, insights into life and human nature. We're going to ask about archetypes on page 1030. For example, notice in the box there, you can have the trickster, the clever person, or the animal who can fool others. You're going to have the hero's quest. I already mentioned this, the Odyssean quest, right? You're going to have the, let's get these two words in our notes, protagonist, the antagonist, right? That is to say, the protagonist, the character with whom the audience most identifies. The antagonist, that is to say, the character that somehow struggles against the protagonist. You're also going to have, of course, let's say it out loud, if you have a hero in epic traditions, you have to have a monster. And those monsters are not only going to be fun monsters or scary monsters or interesting monsters, they're going to be archetypical monsters as well. In other words, they're going to reference some kind of personality type. So, put it in your notes. When Odysseus goes into the cave and he meets the one-eyed monster Polyphemus, the Cyclops, one of the things that this monster will represent is the violation of a thing we will call xenia. Xenia, X-E-N-I-A, xenia. It means hospitality. It means if some stranger shows up at your house, you're not supposed to jack them. Instead, you're supposed to feed them and take care of them. And then and only then in Greek culture can you actually ask, who are you and where are you from and what do you want? But that's not what Polyphemus does. The Cyclops, in fact, picks up a couple of Odysseus' men, eats them. And for this, he is archetypical then of a monster who violates the most fundamental kind of acts, xenia. Okay? There are different forms of the oral tradition over on 1031. These are important. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'm pointing it out to you. Make sure you read it. We have, first of all, the form of myth, right? There are some examples that are provided for us here. Explains the actions of gods and heroes. Notice we are talking often about Greek and Roman myths when we are talking about in the Western tradition. And that's what we mean with this term that is in bold, classical mythology. So put that in your notes. When we're talking about classical mythology, we are talking about these stories to explain the unexplainable. I'll come back to that later in another lecture. The stories to explain the unexplainable that were specific to first Greek and then Roman culture. Okay. We also have folk tales. Follows a usually simple formula. Deals with heroics, adventure, magic, romance. Right? Frequently contains animal characters. Includes fables and fairy tales. We'll have some of this, by the way, in our junior year, just to set you up, when we begin our study of Native American mythologies and folklore and folktale. We also have legend. Another form of the oral tradition. Recounts adventures of a real hero from the past, relates events that may or may not be based on historical truth. Includes tall tales, including obviously exaggeration. And finally, we have epic. Long narrative poems describing deeds of a larger-than-life hero, combining features of myth and legend, depicting a hero who usually goes on a dangerous journey, you want to write that one down, or quest. The hero is helped or hindered by supernatural creatures or gods, and usually gives, as we have said, a portraiture of the culture at large, right? On 1032, we will be focusing a lot at 2a in our annotative work on determining themes. The theme, the insight, put that in your notes. That's what theme means. Insight or message that the details combine to convey, right? You can have themes that are often implied. You see that bold word there on 1032. You can have the development of themes to introduce or develop a theme. Writers create patterns of events and actions or contrast between characters and their fates. By identifying such patterns, you will gain clues to the implied theme. For example, you can look at the title. You can look at the pattern. You can look at generalized restatement. And then, of course, the theme itself, right? Determining universal themes, our next heading, is the key, in many ways, to knowing how to read these classic texts of the oral tradition. Archetypes are then central. So, for example, you can have the story in the example that's given here of the tortoise and the hare, right? That famous story about the tortoise against the hare. Obviously, the hare is supposed to win. You can have the archetypes. For example, the overconfident, boastful character of the hare, the quiet and confident character of the tortoise. You can have plot patterns, notice, combinations in which a weaker character succeeds because of the pride of a stronger character. And then finally, you can have universal themes that are associated with such a story. Slow and steady wins the race. Too much pride can have bad results. Again, we'll see all of these played out in these kinds of stories. Culturally specific themes, right? Not all the themes of the oral tradition are universal. Some are specific to the time and the culture in which the story originated. I mentioned just a moment ago the notion of the patriarchy. We will see stories in the Greek and Roman mythologies, as in other mythologies, where the idea that men are superior to women are a part of the culture, and therefore the stories will have some kind of explanation. At the beginning of the Troy tale, part 2, at the walls of Troy, we are fighting against the Trojans, and the Greeks are. And the Greeks begin to have a fight amongst themselves over 2 women, Trices and Brises. And the idea is simple. 2 guys want the same girl, But what's fascinating is that throughout the entire time, the girl is never even mentioned or consulted or speaks at all. She is simply there in the wings waiting. Well, what kind of story is that? Well, it's a story of a very patriarchal culture. Ironically, though, in the Odyssey, the goddess who drives all the action is in fact Athena, not male but female. We'll begin to see some of the interesting kinds of ways in which a cultural story already is beginning to show the seeds of the evolution out of that patriarchy, possibly. On 1033, we continue about analyzing point of view and cultural experience. Point of view, the perspective of the author, right? Consisting of his or her attitudes towards and beliefs about a subject. This is significant as we study. They give you the example about an author's cultural perspective or point of view. Cultural perspectives and purpose obviously is a part of this as well. Notice you can have multiple purposes. Do you see it at the bottom of 1033 on the left-hand side? Let's get them in our notes. The purposes can be to entertain, they can be to inform or explain, they can even be to persuade. So for example, if you want young men to go off and fight in a war, one of the best ways to do that is to provide a story about a hero that loves to go off and fight in a war. Right? That is to say, there can be a propagandist, persuasional component to these kinds of stories, and we want to pay attention to that, obviously. We can have the changing point of view as stories were passed down from one generation to the next, for example. You can have multiple different renditions from a different culture. They give you the example of Cinderella. I won't go through this in detail, but I will recommend, take a look at that box on 1033. It is fascinating to recognize the ways in which the Cinderella motif, you're all familiar with that idea, that story, has an evolution of its own. Finally, we can do a close read. Theme and point of view. I'm with you now on 1034. Notice that this is the challenge for us, and what your textbook is going to try to do in Unit 6 in the opening pages is to give you a sense of how to look at a couple of titles and to work through those titles in guided ways. Notice the colorization. Do you see it? So, for example, you have different colors that are going to help you to recognize the different aspects we're looking at. For example, the clues to theme and point of view. Archetypes, notice in the pink. Direct statements or observations, notice in the green color. We have social and cultural context, we have characters, we have setting, we have word choice and sentence patterns. All of this kind of stuff is the work that we do at level 2 in our annotative approach. However, now, as freshmen, we're really demanding of ourselves that we begin to break those down into specific areas of focus and be intentional in our reading of the text. So, for example, we can say, yeah, I know what the text says, level 1. But when I ask, what does the text mean? At level 2A, themes, messages. At level 2B, the rhetoric. When I'm using rhetoric, I'm talking about this stuff that's listed on 1034. Since we're there, let's look at our model, shall we? And let's in fact do a practice annotation. So take out a sheet of paper and let's work the annotation together. We're on 1035, and we're now going to read from a very famous epic poem, the Ramayana. Now, this is a poem that comes from a different tradition entirely than the tradition that we are familiar with. And yet, as we work through this, we're going to see some, I've got gamers that are going to say, wow, a whole lot of gaming culture is built on these ancient epic stories. Let's take a look really quickly at this one. The Ramayana, top of page 1035. Now I'm just reading with you. Read along with me. The Ramayana is one of the famous epic poems of India. So write that down. The Ramayana comes from India, one of the oldest civilizations in the history of the world. The poet Valmiki wrote the earliest surviving version in the ancient Indian language of Sanskrit, you want to write that down, sometime after 300 BC, before the Common Era. Grounded in Hindu culture, you want to write that down, the poem tells the life story of Rama, who embodies the spirit of the Hindu god Vishnu. So Rama is the hero who will embody the spirit of the Hindu god Vishnu. We'll begin with a little bit of background information. As an adult, Rama is about to inherit the throne from his father when evil plots result in his banishment from the kingdom. For 14 years, he wanders in exile with his wife Siti and his brother La Shakima. During this time, Sita is kidnapped by the evil giant Ravana. So write that down. The evil giant is Ravana, the monster, the bad guy, chief of a group of Rakshasas, or demons. His name means he who makes the universe scream. Rama sets out to rescue Sita with the help of Humanu, the monkey god, and a huge battle ensues. This selection opens as the battle is reaching its climax. Let's put it in our notes. You almost never, it seems, have an epic poem without battles of some kind. They may be huge contests, or they may be individual struggles or whatever. Notice already, though, that the archetype is being mentioned there. Do you see the number 5? Do you see that on page 1035? Notice Sita's kidnapping sets up the conflict between Rama and Ravana. This struggle is an archetype that expresses an important universal theme, the question of whether good or evil ultimately triumphs. Let's read about this. And again, for my gamers in the house, it is a fair question to ask, why is it that easily 80% or more of the games that have been invented involve fighting? Now that is an interesting question. Some of you will say, well, that's because it makes money. No. You totally missed it. It makes money because people play it. People play it because they like it. Why are so many games rooted in fighting? The answer is the ancient stories that are told and retold and retold will in fact often, I would say almost always it seems, involve some kind of struggle or contest or fighting. Let's take a look at an example from India. Every moment, I just hope you're reading with me on 1035. Every moment, news came to Ravana of fresh disasters in his kingdom. That is to say, already the bad guy is starting to be a bit worried. One by one, most of his commanders were lost. No one who went forth with battle cries was heard of again. Cries and shouts and the wailings of the widows and of warriors came over the chants and songs of triumph that his courtiers arranged to keep up at the